So last class I did a little summary of Gerald Brun's take on the radical turn in hermeneutics. And that focused on the work of Martin Heidegger. And that's where the radical turn takes place. And I tried to frame it, and I was taking issue with Bruns's portrait in the same way I take issue with Eagleton's framing of it as well, and other people can take issue with my framing of it. But what I think they share in common is the sense that there is a tradition of hermeneutics. So the title of this is called Phenomenology, Hermeneutics, Reception Theory. And Eagleton in the second chapter tries to present again, an account of how originally the idea of hermeneutics is to present a universal means of acquiring and disseminating meaning. And the best representative of that view is probably Friedrich Schleiermacher, at least in terms of his influence. Plato translator, by the way, interestingly. Very good translation of Plato. But famous for his liberal theological hermeneutics. And his belief is that the act of interpretation is getting inside the spirit of the writer, the original author. And that is the task of the reader, is to inhabit the mind of the author who wrote the text, with the idea that the text is a reflection of that, but also that the text is not all that can be said about that author's mind, and by knowing more about the context of the author's writing, we will know his mind better, and so they contextualize and historicize, and will present the historical context, say, for the Apostle Paul's writing, or for Homer's writing, or Plato's writing. We'll look at what was going on in his day and his culture, and then we'll take his text and we'll understand that when his mind is producing this work, he has other things in mind, and maybe if we know those details as well, that we'll have a better, fuller understanding of what the author is writing. So it's historicizing things to some extent and providing context to the text. And Schleiermacher is very optimistic about this project, and he thinks that we can know, and I'm quoting here, at least in an English translation, that we can know as well, if not better, than the original author. And the reason we can know better is that we have this thing called historical distance, which the original author doesn't have. We're aware of his biases, his prejudices, and he is not, to some degree. Like, when we live our lives, we're often following along with the thinking and the ideas of the day rather unconsciously. We just take things for granted and don't flesh out all the things we're presupposing when we present them in the text. And the idea here is based on that recognition of finitude, and the fact that, again, we often don't announce all of our, think of it in terms of mathematics, all the steps we took to get from the problem to the solution. And when you're in more advanced mathematics, you can fill a whole whiteboard with the steps that it takes along the way to get to the solution. If we see the problem and then we see the solution, we don't see the steps. And some of those steps are questionable steps. And the solution might be questionable as a result of that. But by looking at it from a distance, we can see that steps have been taken because the solution doesn't make any sense to us. How did he get to this outcome? Why does Plato assert his view of the forms and the ideas? And why is the Republic, going after the poets? Like, what is it? It's a very strange thing for a philosopher. How come he's bothered by that? And so on. So those certain things along the way. But the idea of romantic hermeneutics and the way that we can make progress in understanding is precisely because we are not caught in their context. And we can see their their biases very clearly because we don't share them. And that's helpful in this sense. So the problem is I don't understand you. On the other hand, I can see where you think very differently than me, and it isn't very, what you've said here is just clearly wrong. So we learn from their mistakes, as it were. And that gives rise to the idea, and this is the case in the Geisteswissenschaft, in the human sciences, there is a sense that we can make progress intellectually because of that sense of awareness of other people's errors, but we can know as well, if not better. If not better than the original authors. And it's because of historical distance. Now, that's where both Eagleton and Bruns start. They start with Romantic hermeneutics. And they might push this project back to the 18th century. And I do as well. Say that there's a decisive turn in the 18th century. But what they don't do, and which I tried to do last time, and I'm going to continue to do this, is to say and connect the very point at which this begins, because I don't think they do this very well. And it doesn't begin with Schleiermacher, and it doesn't begin with Hegel, and it doesn't begin with any of the authors that they mention. It begins with a perspective on humanity and on the distinctive feature of humanity, namely language. Those two things. It's a look at humanity from the outside, from a universal perspective. And a philosopher by the name of Thomas Nagel calls the view, and I'll write his name down here, Nagel, calls it the view from nowhere. I came to agree with this position, by the way. Wrote about it in my doctoral thesis, and spoke of this universal perspective and the problems with it. And one of the examiners said, "Oh, you're agreeing with Thomas Nagel's view in the view from nowhere." And I said, am I? I haven't read the book. So, oh, okay. Well, that sounds interesting. I should read that, which I then did. And yes, so the idea of the view from nowhere is that it's an idea of absolute objectivity, unprejudiced, above space and time, from an infinite distance. That's the attempt that the 18th century philosophers, that we don't even call philosophers for the most part, but theorists of education like Rousseau and Herder and the German transcendentalists, or rationalists, if you will, they look on humanity from the perspective of no prejudice. They try and take a view from nowhere, above humanity, from an infinite height, from a God's eye perspective, in order to establish a certitude to the humanities that they've managed to also, and they've noticed that in the natural sciences, this perspective of obtaining objectivity has been quite useful. I talked about that a few times, the scientific method being applied to the natural sciences and objective verification. What the humanities are equally trying to do is obtain objectivity, and they do it by promoting a view from nowhere. And then they talk about and this is Immanuel Kant's very shift, the Copernican turn he talks about, is to try and make, rather than us conform to the world, the ideas, the objects of knowledge, and say this is objective because these are objects, he flips it around and says, rather than our mind conforming to the world as it exists, let's conceive of it the other way around as sort of a thought experiment, just like Descartes. let's imagine that the world conforms to our capacities to perceive it. And what are the conditions of knowledge then that we need to declare and recognize in order for that to be possible? And he calls that the critique of pure reason. And I suggested last time the purity of the reasoning is exactly this. It's the nowhereness of the view. Now, there are certain conditions that he announces there that will be necessary for us to do that, but those are related to our minds. But then objectivity is now in the mind rather than in the objects, traditionally speaking. So he's flipping objectivity, subjectivity on their heads, which makes it very confusing. And it's a confusion that I don't think goes away, and it's deeply problematic. But still at that point, the aim and the belief in the early phases of that project, and by the early phases I'm talking about the period we call the Enlightenment, are that we can get these sort of universal human truths about human nature, even though we are humans. And the way we do this is we just don't conceive ourselves as having a physical bodily being, because a physical bodily being can be seen and can be located in space and time and in cultures and nations and so forth. And we want to get a sort of knowledge that is not specific to a particular country or tribe or nation or language or whatever. They want to get to the origins of all this. And they're always trying to go back to origins. And the origin that they're chiefly after is the heavenly perspective of nowhere. And these are enormously influential, and I think they are on the sciences even, quite frankly. Because scientists come up with theories, and the theories are based on a model of looking at things, and they have to have a model in mind when they test out their theories, and the models they have in mind often come from the poets. Actually, so the Big Bang Theory. How do we get something from nothing? Well, there was a Big Bang, and then everything came from nothing, which sounds a bit like Christian doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, except that everything doesn't come from nothing. Everything comes from God, who creates everything from nothing. There is something outside of space and time, and before there was nothing, God existed. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? But God is there. His being pre-exists the created being, which came out of nothing. He doesn't create it from a pre-existent matter. He creates it out of nothing. But there is a being there before all of what we recognize as created being exists. But if you don't want to acknowledge God, and the 18th century does not want to acknowledge God in any way, they want to remove God from the system, and they demonstrate this by removing theology from the university, even though the university has nothing to hold it together without God, because the study of the university assumed that God held all things together in his being. And all things were created by him and for him, and nothing was made that hasn't been made, and in him all things hold together. That was the basic idea of the university. There has to be something unifying all these diverse realms of knowledge, these different liberal arts. And that would be God. Now, if you remove God, you remove the center, you remove the unity. So how do you create that unity if you are going to remove God and the center point of the whole intellectual system? Well, then you have to root it in something else, and that will be humanity. But humanity has the problem of finitude, so you solve the problem of finitude by universalizing man. That's what you're doing. You're universalizing man. And so you come up with sciences, so-called sciences, realms of knowledge, and you name them. And one of them is called anthropology. And the anthropos is just simply the Greek word for man, or mankind. And the ology is a science, the science of man, the study of man, the scientific study of man. And so what it does is it extends that study of mankind back into history from the perspective of the present, which is just presumed, stated to be universal and without prejudices. And then you backdate it to get from the present to a plausible narrative that will allow you to demonstrate how what came from the beginning all the way to the present. And they'll give a time frame on it as well, because they'll notice, well, actually, for what we're proposing to take place, we cannot accept an idea of 6,000 years. It's not possible. We can't even see that much change in hundreds of years. In fact, we can barely see any. As quickly as we're trying to change everything, that it's not working. So we have to posit millions of years, for which there can't be any evidence, of course, in the scientific objective account. There's no eyewitnesses to this. There's no way of verifying that. It is just a pure theory, which is posited for the age of the earth, etc., and the universe, right? And then they will try and find evidence for that length of time. I don't have a problem with the idea, by the way. The idea of trying out an idea and seeing if the evidence might fit that. Then that's how you theorize, and then you look at the evidence. Yes.
I don't want to.
No, please do interrupt me.
Make a tangent, but I do think there's some validity to reckon with in terms of the speed of light, and also the gradation of Earth layers.
Yeah.
Because so it's actually like an astronomical and geological like positing.
Yes, and that was the case. That's correct, and that would have demonstrated, given some validity to the ideas of a long view of time, creation of the earth, etc. The problem is that the quantum physics of the 20th century demonstrated that actually that's not the right way to see it. It's not the right way. It's insufficiently. It doesn't actually fit all the evidence of the way things look. And without I don't want to get into quantum physics and so forth. So I'm trying to make this clear in some ways. And quantum physics makes everything confusing. Because what quantum physics declares is that light is both a particle and a wave, both, which are not commensurable. You can't. Those are contradictory concepts. They want to reduce everything to one or the other, and in general, that makes sense because we want a clear and simple idea that will explain that. And quantum physics throws the spanner into that whole conceptual framework and suggests actually it's both. And I think it can't be both. It's not. That's right. And but there's evidence of both things happening, and 20th century physics has demonstrated, I think, that the age of the earth discussions, which were predicated on the knowledge being presented at the time, Newtonian physics, etc., is insufficient to explain the reality of the way things actually work. And the age of the earth, however, was in the period where it was assumed that way of reckoning time, etc., was valid. Anyway, that gets us really off on a tangent. It's just to say that the time frame for presenting anthropology and the length of time needed for this to be proclaimed valid was, the aim of that was to provide a quasi-theological account of human nature that would sufficiently explain man objectively. And to do that, they had to start doing things like extend how long it would take for the world to be created, and extend all manner of things. So the whole framework that would have been presented biblically, and how you read Scripture's view of time and space and so forth, had to be adapted to the view from nowhere. That's what's going on in that period. And likewise, the idea that human nature is fundamentally to be understood from the Kantian subjective of interiority. So the ideas of outside of us conform to our capacities to perceive it, which is a view from nowhere as well, it's just an internalized view from nowhere, puts psychology at the center of the human sciences. It makes us think that psychology is the most important of all sciences, which is why in universities, including Christian universities, most of the students flood into psychology. It's an extraordinary thing. But it is so. And psychologists have a great deal of validity in terms of the courts of law. If you bring a psychologist in and he gives a testimony, he has more weight than almost any expert that you could find. That's how strongly we hold the validity of the psychologist in that day as a scientist. So he's an objective. He gives us an objective account of the reality of human nature. So psychology emerges, anthropology, sociology as well. These are new ologies, all of which are calibrated to give an account of the view from nowhere of man about man, and at the same time a universality to it. And Eagleton doesn't really get into that, and neither does Bruns for that matter. He sees it all beginning, in Bruns's case, with Luther. It's a very strange charge to make. You think he totally misunderstands Luther, although he sees something in it that I understand makes him think that, namely that the method thereafter is to insist on the text and let the text speak for itself rather than contextualizing constantly. I get that. That, in a sense, is rather Lutheran. But this view from nowhere perspective, which grounds the humanities, arises in the 18th century, long after Luther. And that's when the change happens. It's got nothing to do with Luther. But the methodology, interestingly, of the humanities professors who want to hold on to the traditional humanities is to basically play the Luther card and say, we're not going to look at context. You guys are always contextualizing, and there's never any meaning in the text. We're going to insist that we look at the text and nothing but the text. And there is no outside of the text. It's just the text. We're going to the word will speak for itself. The text will speak for itself. Don't contextualize and tell me what Shakespeare ate for breakfast or how his view of the opposite sex or religion informed his writing, or this particular life event made him write Hamlet. Like his son Hamlet died, and therefore he wrote Hamlet as some sort of therapy. So they're always explaining away and drawing attention to texts or context and pulling us away from the text concern. Anyway, that view from nowhere is the one that both Eagleton and Bruns call phenomenology. And phenomenology, rather, is the late development of it. The idea that ideas present themselves in a form that we can see. But there are universal principles behind that, and the universal principles are related to the view from nowhere. And in my other classes, I have argued that a great representation of this, I think it helps have pictures in your mind of what's going on as well. Now, the view from nowhere, obviously you can't have a picture from it because it literally is coming from nowhere. But one way of seeing it demonstrated in the time concerned is the Palace of Versailles. The Palace of Versailles, if you stand, let me see if I can put this, find something here. I'll put it up here on the whiteboard behind me eventually. When you stand in the Palace of Versailles, it's up on a hill, first of all. And because of that, when you stand and from within the building itself and you look out, you actually don't see anything. It's like a city in the clouds. It's above the horizon. There is no horizon. There's nothing. And so it's a sublime perspective in that sense. because the sublimity suggests grandeur and immensity and limitlessness, etc. The Palace of Versailles, when you look out from the palace, you see that God's eye perspective, just like you are when you're in an airplane and you look and you see nothing. You're up in the clouds. You might see the clouds like once you break above it, and there's literally nothing there. You can't see anything. And the Palace of Versailles is actually predicated on that idea of creating the sense of being above the earth. And it's represented politically in how the monarch will seek to rule the world as well, using pure reasoning, and will do so for the sake of humanity from the position of the sun. And Louis XIV is called the Sun King, even. And the idea of a power around which the rest of the world would revolve. And from his vantage point, however, he was doing so for the benefit of mankind. But he had no connection with mankind whatsoever, his people. And the tyranny of this perspective became evident in France when the revolt against him took place that we call the French Revolution. And but so removed were Louis and his wife Marie Antoinette that when she was told that the people were starving, they had no bread, she said, let them eat cake. Because again, in her world, the idea of not having enough food was impossible to even imagine. If you don't have bread, we'll have cake then. An extravagance. She just does not get it at all. She probably ate cake all day. What do I know? But that idea, and that's the problem with the view from nowhere, is that there's no connection with the world even here and now. Never mind the past. That methodology of abstraction and universal truths related to goodness, beauty, truth has no empirical demonstration except from absence. Absence is the illustration. Silence is the illustration of the power of this word. Space, immensity, enormity. In other words, power. These are all illustrations of power. Pure absolute power without limit. To which they try and posit a so-called human perspective. But it's a human perspective without any humanity. You see the problem. And the French Revolution is a backlash against that. And it's a backlash that's equally strong. So one abstracts us from all human sympathy, and the other pushes in the exact opposite direction and says, no, the most important thing is human sympathy, human sympathy, human sympathy. And if you ever want to listen to and I encourage this, and I thought if I had more time, if I'd arrived early enough and hadn't been delayed by traffic this day, I was going to line up the music for it. Listen to the 18th century classical music, like of Bach. And then listen to the Wilhelm Tell Overture. The one is suggesting a majesty and an order and a beauty, and it's Christian. He's connecting it very much to the orderly procession of God in all areas of life. Handel's Messiah, equally so. Whereas in the Wilhelm Tell Overture, it's all about freedom and emancipation from tyranny and also chaos. It's just chaos. Order, chaos. It's a strong appeal to chaos as the human means of liberation, but it's a reaction against Louis XIV and a tyrannous perspective. That's the problem. But here's the second problem: those that would remove the tyrant's boot from our necks are themselves tyrants. That's the problem. The French Revolution proposes chaos as the solution to absolute tyrannical order, and it's arguably worse. It's certainly no better, but it's an idea with a consequence, because all ideas have consequences. So the Romantic solution to this, which he connects, both men will connect to Heidegger, which is the language and focus on language as the house of being. So rather than the view from nowhere, the view from somewhere, and the somewhere is always situated, always in the world, always the product of being in the world, to use Heidegger's phrase, is the so-called linguistic turn. He calls this the linguistic turn. And I think it's useful, but it's only useful if you understand it as a reaction against the ideational turn, or the view from nowhere. It's like stimulus and response. Humanities as the view from nowhere. Let's look at man as if he has no nature. That's the discipline of psychology. Let's look at, and anthropology, let's look at man as if he has no nature in and himself. And then we will create his nature out of nothing, the way we want man to be. And then we'll posit, again, a very primal organic origin, and then we will postulate an increasingly rational and non-corporeal being to arise out of that. And you'll see it in the science fiction, that the evolved lunar, the grand lunar in H.G. Wells' First Man on the Moon, he's got a head the size of a planet. He's an intellect. He's evolved so that his mind is the essential feature of himself. Whereas those that serve him have enormous bodies and certain aspects of their bodies that are useful, and they're bred for that purpose. But the evolved perspective is the one where the mind is greater and the body is lesser. So these end up being anthropological problems that are rooted in a view from nowhere. And the backlash against it in the linguistic turn is the view from somewhere which is a situatedness, or rather than history, what was the stupid phrase that we used last night? Historicality. You got to come up with a new word. It's not history, it's historicality. This one, the view from nowhere, is going to posit history as a way of accounting for how we got from an embodied brutish existence like cavemen, which is, by the way, just hypothetical speculation and absurd at that. There's no evidence of cavemen at all. None. It's just like people were in caves. So it doesn't mean they only lived in caves. Like it's a funny hypothesis, actually. It's so absurd. And yet it's there in anthropology textbooks as if there's evidence for this. Well, there are drawings inside of caves. Okay, I can go draw in a cave. Does that make me a caveman? I mean, really hilarious suggestions. But that's the account of history, is how we got from that existence up to the present. Historicality is a different emphasis. History fits with the view from nowhere. And from that, we'll have a certain type of history, which is the Whig view of history. This is what it's called. The Whig view of history. And what is the Whig view of history? It's the account of great men who bring us from the benighted past to the enlightened present. Continual progress. But that's the view of history. Gosh, I can't even read that. Whig. No, I shouldn't even. The Whig view of history. Now that's historicism, and that is from the Enlightenment. And the human sciences are going to agree with that. The progressives, the ones that think that the Enlightenment gave us all the goods that we currently enjoy and should continue to enjoy. Jordan Peterson is one of this camp, by the way. He's an old school liberal, if you will, who adheres to the Whig view of history. Sciences, and the proof of this is we'll look at all the technological devices that have come along to better human life. And you can acknowledge many of them, modern medicine and so forth. So the view from nowhere, the idea that led to not just the study of the heavens through the telescope, but the microscope. Oh, we suddenly see that there's life, even at a granular level, below our threshold to perceive. Not just above it, but below it. That view, though, however, in the linguistic turn, points to the problem of language itself, which is that language itself is rooted in a human nature that is ineradicably solid and is not amenable to a view from nowhere. It expresses that, and the language also is situated in a time and place and people and culture, and it's irretrievably so. So it, rather than appealing to history, it appeals to historicality. And so rather than the truth of rationalism, this sort of rationalism, it will be the sort of, what do we want to call this? Certainly the humanity in some ways, or the embodiness of irrationalism. And it will actually see this view from nowhere as the enemy. So to make human progress, we are going to have to react against every last thing that the Enlightenment postulated, but particularly its view of the goodness of human reasoning. Because human reasoning is a white European concept, and it is antithetical to human nature. And so they'll posit again things like 2 + 2 is 4 is European math, white European math. And my response to this is always, your view of reasoning presupposes that the only form of reasoning is the one that is announced in the 17th, 18th century. There's a long, very long tradition of reasoning that antedates this period. In fact, it's the one that we call the Christian era, in which the Logos is at the center of that enterprise. And if you want to demonstrate this, it doesn't take long. Look at Thomas Aquinas, the most rational person who ever lived, constantly appealing to reason. And true of the whole medieval period and the Renaissance, for that matter, there is appeal to the rationality of the world. In every area, it makes us blush. Would make a Jordan Peterson blush. Would make me blush. The extraordinary appeal to logic and rationality. But actually, that they'll say the same thing will be true in music. It will be true in the arts. It will be true in geometry. In geometry, by the way, you can't even enter Plato's academy if you don't know geometry. He won't let you in. And again, you can see from the Gardens of Versailles, they have a very geometric way of presenting the world, very orderly and so forth. That's good. But the ideal is not looking down, it's looking up and assuming that what is universal results in this perspective looking down, and it doesn't actually. It doesn't. It just results in dissolution. And it results in those in power having no sympathies whatsoever with those that they rule over. They see no commonality between their nature and the nature of their subjects, because they've eradicated any nature to human nature. They think that they're godlike. But this turn, the linguistic turn, the focus on the language as opposed to the reason of the word. Remember I said that this study could be also seen in the account of the origin of language, and that's really key. When they look at language, human language, from the outside, as if it were something that they didn't use to study the subject, because you have to use language to describe what you're accounting for, right? But they act as if the tool of language with which they're describing the account of the origin of language was a neutral, objective tool, but it isn't. And it can't be. It's not possible to do that. Actually, you can do it in using numbers. Numbers will allow you to do that, but even when you try and understand numbers, you have to convert it into language to communicate with most people, at any rate, and in fact, even amongst themselves. I've not yet met the scientist who doesn't communicate in language, although it may pain them a little bit, because they find it's more beautiful to write in mathematical form. If you meet physicists that are really high-end physicists, they love looking at things in terms of numbers. They think it's beautiful and orderly, and more accurate, and it probably is. And the Christian view says that these are just different streams of the same bigger picture, actually, but they ought to fit with one another, for that matter. But that view from nowhere, when it applies not to history but then to language, is going to posit what? Irrationality at the beginning, which is the grunts and cries, leading to ever greater rationality. So it starts with the ages of the poets, theologians, and then along come the philosophers, like Mr. Socrates, and he gives a more rational account of what the poets have hitherto described, and the poet theologians, like Hesiod, giving an account of gods and his theogony, gives way to the scientists. And what will the scientists use? Rather than language, well, they'll use numbers as their technique. And in each account, they get further and further removed from the word. And that's the way in which the human sciences make progress on the humanities. The humanities hitherto had focused on these gentlemen, but the scientists going forward will not understand reality in terms of words. They'll see it in terms of numbers, because that's the way we give the account of the progress of humanity from somewhere to nowhere. How do we get to the view from nowhere? By abstracting knowledge out of language, even into number. And so statistics is now king, and the number becomes king. And that isn't going to be sufficient even, because numbers also suggests a finitude. They suggest like a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4, although there is no such thing as an object, a 1 or a 2 or a 3 empirically verifiable. It's a concept. These all suggest a finitude, and the best representation are twofold. And this is the binary. There's a 1 and a 0. And the solution is, if you want to follow this trajectory of creating the ideal world, is to go from the oneness of reality towards the nothingness. It actually pushes us towards annihilation. Add an N, so it doesn't become A, but annihilation. It pushes us towards zero, so that the ideal of the view from nowhere becomes realized. And this is going to lead us towards what comes at the end of the course, posthumanism, or, if you prefer, anti-humanism. Because the human is a product of the past that we're making progress from. Progress is not defined by a goal, it's defined only backward looking. Because remember, we're coming at things from the view from nowhere, from a position of there's nowhere where we are, and we have to. By the way, the word for nowhere is utopia. Topos. No place. Utopian schemes can be seen one of two ways. There's an ideal in the past, so you sentimentalize the past and make it an ideal world, or you can flip it around, and this is how science fiction works. The ideal's in the future, and the future will be fitting more of the nihilistic features there. Nihilism is the characteristic feature of 20th century philosophy, and it's because of this dynamic that I illustrated that is there in the early period of establishing the human sciences. Now, the linguistic turn, on the other hand, moves away from that, and it emphasizes situatedness and historicality and being in the world, and talks about language as the house of being. We can't understand any reality outside of language. So it's a resistance to this move towards nothingness. because this is the tendency of this form. It drives everything to nothing, a sort of perfection, whereas this pushes it towards unity, pushes it hard, towards unity in all things. And the result of that, oh no, it's on the board. The result of that is the rise of hard nationalism, like in Heidegger's day. Hardcore nationalism. With the emphasis on nature. Nature idealized, so that nature is now not seen in the way that the Gardens of Versailles portrays it, but rather in the primal wilderness. And there's a unity seen in that, a oneness to which we are being driven to conform ourselves to. So rather than the pattern of nothingness, it's the pattern of unity. We want to blend ourselves into the natural world, become one with it, see ourselves as a part of nature. And so that with this linguistic turn, there's going to be a hard turn towards environmentalism. What is that? It's situatedness. The environs is the Greek word for what's around us. And as I say, that leads to various, now when it's still under the guise of nationalism, which we're moving away from, it's going to express itself in, as I say, Nazi ideology of Nazi Germany, Nazi fascist Italy, and so forth, even in Japan in some ways, although that's a strange other form, but still there's a sort of a sense of unity. But even that can't escape this account of history, because this account of history is inevitably evolutionary. It's progressive. It has to give an account of human nature. It doesn't take human nature as a fixed attribute that we bear by virtue of being made in the image of God through time and space. Every person who's ever lived bears the image of God. It suggests that we become human. We aren't human, we become human. And how do we become human? By becoming more and more disembodied, more and more idealized, more and more rational, more and more distanced from time and space and place. And this is a push back, and actually, I actually don't even see it as anything other than two sides of the same coin. It still has the ideal of the Enlightenment of progress, but it sees the progress not in the immaterial, but in the material. So heavy emphasis then on materialism. And it fits really well with communism as well as fascism. Fascism is just national form of communism. It's called National Socialism. That's what the Nazis call themselves. The communists are international socialists. So but they're in agreement that it's the material. It's not the non-material reality, which is the ideal. It's the material, and the material is best expressed not in the zero, but in the one. There's something there. That's the basic form of reality, and we're going to push everything towards that. And then bring in Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, etc. But the most important ones are at the bottom of the scale. Anyway, I'm talking about big pictures now, but I think literary theory is that. Now, what do you do with that? What does that result in text? Note how Eagleton begins this chapter. He says, in 1918, Europe lay in ruins, devastated by the worst war in history. In the wake of that catastrophe, a wave of social revolutions rolled across the continent. The years around 1920 were to witness the Berlin Spartacus uprising and the Vienna general strike, the establishment of workers' Soviets in Munich and Budapest, and mass factory occupations throughout Italy. He didn't mention what happened in 1917 in Moscow. Isn't that funny? Why didn't he do that? That's an odd thing. This is a communist revolution. And he's a Marxist. He doesn't mention that. There are strikes. all over in places that are not associated with this. Okay, but it's a universe. Okay, but we all know that this is also happening, and he doesn't mention a funny old thing. Anyway, all this insurgency was violently crushed. True, but the social order of European capitalism had been shaken to its roots by the carnage of the war and its turbulent political aftermath. The ideologies on which that order had customarily depended, the cultural values by which it ruled, were also in deep turmoil. Science seemed to have dwindled to a sterile positivism. True, a myopic obsession with the categorizing of facts. Philosophy appeared torn between such a positivism on the one hand and an indefensible subjectivism on the other. Yes, forms of relativism and irrationalism were rampant, and art reflected this bewildering loss of bearings. In both cases, that is true. Because the linguistic turn does not begin with Heidegger, even though this is the account. The linguistic turn begins with the Romantics. The Enlightenment, the Romantics, and then they keep playing out back and forth, back and forth. So this is where I take issue with the account here. You can find the linguistic turn of, so if you want to call this modernism and call this postmodernism, you wouldn't be wrong. So this is modernism, and this sort of irrationality is postmodernism. True in both cases. Good way of discriminating the two is just seeing this back and forth. Postmodernism, the roots of it or the origins of it can be found in the Romantics and in the French Revolution. That's where you can see postmodernism playing out right away. And they both carry on, both sides. They don't go away. One side does not win, the other doesn't. And both of them are predicated on the same view of human nature. It's not a theological view of human nature. They deny there's any integrity to human being. They don't see human beings bearing the image of God. In the case of the Romantics, they see human beings having an integrity being crushed by this view from nowhere, and they want to appeal to nature as the ground of the validity of human being. We share a commonality with the animals and with the trees and with the birds and the air and the water, etc. We are one. We are one, yes. Panentheism is the mark of Romanticism. It emphasizes oneness. The Enlightenment emphasizes nothingness. They will limp on together. My contention is that both of them are erroneous. Both paths lead to impossible outcomes, and destructive ones at that, because the emphasis on the oneness is fascism and communism. Both of them are direct outcomes of the chaos of Romanticism. It's bringing chaos into order. And neither of them value human nature. It's demonstrated in Nazi Germany by what happens to the 6 million Jews that they exterminate. It's also demonstrated by what they do to other races. It's also demonstrated by the fact that they think that they have to exterminate or defeat other nations, other bloodlines, other representations of physical human nature in order to demonstrate that they are making progress and are the master species. They demonstrate Darwinian evolution socially. They have to show this. The communists are no better, other than that they don't see it in national form. They think that we have to defeat, that the material world has to defeat the immaterial. And so they suggest that the early communists think that the realm of ideas is like theology. It's the opium of the masses, but it's not actually speaking of any reality. The real reality is the means. It's the common ground. It's the stuff, the material. As I said, Marx himself did his PhD on the Greek atomistic philosopher Democritus, and the atom is the one thing that is uncuttable. You can't divide a one. Well, you can into fractions, but an atom is an uncuttable thing. From tome to cut, and this is an uncuttable thing. It's a basic unit. Nothing smaller than an atom, and the idea then is to reduce everything to oneness and to live in that oneness. So both of them are strong, ideologically emphasized And I would say just simply, which is superior? Well, I would rather have rationality than irrationality myself. Because rationality suggests comprehensibility and order and communicability and all that. So I'd rather be with the Enlightenment than with the Romantics, for sure. But I think that both of them are actually have serious flaws. And a Christian worldview and a Christian view of human nature and a Christian view of the Word and the text is a far better solution than making a hard turn back to the Enlightenment. That just gives us over to the experts and the predator elite class that has demonstrated that they have no sense of common humanity, just like Louis XIV didn't. Yes?
Sorry, I don't want to ask you to repeat yourself. I kind of understand the postmodern tendency towards eliminating variability, but how does the Enlightenment view lead to nothingness? I just kind of...
Well, it posits to get objectivity, just like the scientific method does, right? Because the whole purpose of the scientific method is to create a methodology that will allow you to study something and obtain results, which then can be verified in a different time and place and get the same outcomes. And so you can prove with your eyes. You don't have to trust tradition, you don't have to trust authority, you don't have to trust the Bible, you don't have to trust anybody, but you can make certain yourself through your experimentation. And you will call that a fact. And what a fact is something that you do. Have you ever thought about people conflate truth and facts all the time? They're not the same. A fact is something that you make. It's from the word facere, from the verb, which is to make, to do. And what you make through your experiment is a proof of the truth. But it's not the whole truth, because the facts can be, other facts can contradict those, and ultimately then you have to appeal to philosophy and theology to come up with theories of truth. But again, those that follow the sciences tend to ignore the fact that they always use philosophy even to define what science is. But let me not get caught into that. But so what's your concern again here?
No, I'm just trying to follow how the Enlightenment view...
what they were trying to do and why they...
How did this lead to zero, kind of?
Because they start with a view from nowhere, which is the ideal form of human nature. It's one that is universal. It's always true. What do we...
From personal experience.
So to eliminate every possibility of difference between me and you, I have to eliminate every difference.
Oh, I see.
Because you occupy a different space even. You have hair, I don't have hair. You could be female, I'm male. You could, like, all of those points of difference to get the ideal have to be eliminated. So the only way to eliminate all human differentiation is simply to eliminate humanity. And then you will achieve the ideal. So it's utopian, and the form of progress is to get rid of all those things. So it's a mathematical ideal being posited and placed upon the humanities as a way of looking at ourselves. And it leads us, the idea has a consequence, is what I'm suggesting. And the immediate consequence is felt politically by Louis XIV when he tries to impose this as a way of improving life, by the way. He says, we're going to use science and we're going to make human life better. And we're going to order things. People up to this point have been left to their own lives. I'm going to make things better for them. Prussians did the exact same thing in Germany. It's used all over the place. So the scientists, the aristocrats, and most of the early scientists were aristocrats, they don't actually, they're not predators the way we often see many scientists these days, fairly or unfairly, often unfairly, trying to gain wealth and power for themselves, although sometimes they do that. I think they're genuinely believing that by pursuing science they can improve the lot of humanity. And if you read their accounts, it's quite clear that that is their aim as well. They want to use it to bless other people. Let's follow the way God has created the world, let's understand it, and then we will utilize that and make the Garden of Eden not a wilderness. It'll be a garden like Louis XIV's Versailles. That's the aim. But the methodology of the view from nowhere defeats their objective. And they don't really see that. The view from nowhere, that objective methodology, abstracts humanity from the equation, and the result is to eliminate humanity from the equation. And the first pang of objection against that, the first strong one, is the French Revolution. The second happens in the Soviet Union. Mr. Eagleton mentions that there was these revolts that happened, strikes that happened, and they were brutally suppressed. That's true. It's also true that the common people did not want another French Revolution. They thought it was counterproductive and it would not result in goods for their families, because they realized that the status quo, the tradition, as bad as it might be, was less bad than having no order at all. And the communists want chaos and disorder. And it results in mass murder, furthermore. That's wherever communism has been, mass murder has ensued. In their monomaniacal pursuit of unity, of all people, we're going to eliminate anybody who disagrees with us. We'll kill everybody who isn't in agreement. And quite frankly, the working classes have far more sense than the intellectuals on this. I'm not buying it. Intellectuals find it easy to be deceived on this thing because they think they're smarter than everyone else. They don't see it. But yes.
So what would be the concrete human ideal for the Enlightenment, and the same for the romantic view? I guess you can say society, but the point that humans reach that's ideal, but in a concrete way. Is there a concrete vision for that?
For the romantics?
For both, for the Enlightenment and the romantic view.
I think both of them want to. If you take, I think the romantics are just creatures of the Enlightenment. I see them as two sides of the same coin. So I don't see them as having a genuine opposition to each other. They have an opposition to the means, not the ends. The end is the same, but the means for the Enlightenment is rationality, and the means for the romantics is feeling. But and feeling is more going to recognize that there's something out there because you feel it. You can't deny reality in that sense. It's going to hit you in the face, or you're going to feel it, and there's a sensitivity. And again, romantic hermeneutics of Schleiermacher wants you to embody the other person's mind. There's something there, and you're to become one with it. There's that process. Whereas the rationalists don't really ever care about that. They say, well, if you focus on the feelings, then you're never going to get to the sort of objectivity necessary to gain the outcome. But they just differ. They differ on means, not on ends. Both of them are utopian. One of them points you to nature, the other points you to space and nothingness. That's the ideal in the two. So for the Enlightenment, it is space or cyberspace, which is an extension of the Enlightenment. Cyber reality, right? Virtual reality. How do you? I think one of the deleterious effects of the internet is it forces people to think about themselves in abstraction all the time as disembodied. It just pushes you in that direction, and it pulls you into it, and they make it attractive by pixelation and by triggering the cerebral cortex, the responses. You get a dopamine hit from clicking on things and stuff like that. So it's a physical response, but it pulls you into that virtual reality, and you would rather watch your stupid cell phone than look and talk to somebody who's right in front of you, because this is more stimulating. Extraordinary. It was presented in a film that I watched 25 years ago, I think it was. Maybe not that long, but it was close to it. American Beauty. You ever watched American Beauty? It's a very perverse film in some ways, but also spectacular in others. But there was a young man. There's a young man who only related to reality through his camera. He's filming everything all the time, and there's a girl who's trying to seduce him, basically undressing in front of him, and he's sitting here filming her, but he can't get rid of the camera. So it shows all sorts of people who are troubled by the world around them, but there's an ideal of human nature represented by what comes at the end of it, which is that human nature is basically, watch the film, it's the plastic bag floating around aimlessly at the end of it's chaos, the view of chaos. is being strongly promoted in that film, and it's strongly against the family and sexual order and so forth. It promotes it. It's opposite everywhere. Very beautiful film, though visually stunning, but the message is visually horrendous or intellectually horrendous. Anyway, but that I see the ideal as the same. Like, what's the difference between oneness and nothingness? Well, if you eradicate all difference, you get nothingness. So you annihilate every difference and you get one, or you're a little bit more extreme, you eliminate all difference and you get nothing. They're in agreement on it. So one way of doing it, the romantic way, is to recognize every self as having an integrity and saying the state should authorize every self, every autonomous self, and create laws so that you have to recognize the humanity of that individual self. And that will be the self-authoring principle of outing yourself or revealing yourself or self-identifying and giving your gender identity. And that's from the romantic side of things. It's irrational, of course it is. It breaks humanity down in absurd ways that don't even exist. You can imagine them. It doesn't matter. We're still going to authorize it. The result of that is to suggest that we're creating a unity. They say they're creating a unity, and everyone else rationally is saying, actually, no, you're destroying everything, every ground of unity. And you think that you're affirming the person when you're destroying the person. You're letting them destroy themselves, and they seem to want to do that. And what you lack is a view of human nature. And you don't care about that. So the Western world is caught up in a fight between the rationalists and the irrationalists, both of which are predicated on a mistake taken in the early 18th century about language and about human nature, which it seems incapable of getting out of. It just keeps flipping back between the two as if there were a genuine difference between the two, and there is no genuine difference between the two. They lead to the same nihilistic outcome. I mean, in Canada, we have made legislation now, which allows people to take their own lives. Canada is a world leader in MAID, people choosing to die. And the government will happily kill you. It's easier to get killed than it is to get helped. Although the killing is presented in forms of helping. In fact, it cloaks itself in compassion. So it's very romantic. We're going to help you because we care about you. Let us kill you, and it's going to be painless. Whatever. As if the pain were the only objection to dying or killing, mass murder. And they'll extend it from those who are at the end of life in extreme situations to those who just are too depressed. Right? So again, the ethics of this whole thing flips back, and there's no means of correcting it from either camp. I'm against them both. It's a pox on both your houses, as far as I'm concerned. Because this wants feeling to be the solution, this wants reason to be solution, and neither of them accounts for human nature, which has both reason and feeling. And a will, for that matter, which is the Greek philosophical view of human nature, where we have reason, we have a will, we have passions, and reason ought to lead the passions, yes, but we can't deny the passions. In fact, we have to recognize that the passions are essential to human nature. And that's why the idea of the incarnation is so important. When God becomes man, he takes on a human body. And when he is crucified, he's crucified bodily. And when he's raised bodily. He's not raised in his spirit. It doesn't fit the Hegelian concept of progress, which is an emancipation from the body. That's the Gnostic view, the Gnostic ideal. That's a heresy. And Hegelian Geisteswissenschaften approaches tend towards that heresy. I already talked about that. But you don't solve that heresy by saying that Jesus was just a man, which is what happens in liberal theology. Jesus is our brother. He's a fellow revolutionary along with us. He opposes the man. He hates the authorities. He's alongside the poor. He identifies with the poor. He's one with the poor. Creates a different problem with the same outcome. And that's because they agree on the ideal. Or it has the same outcome. And so you see no respite, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So this is why when I came to a Christian university after conversion, I thought, I can build here an alternative to the destructive current system of looking at things. But I didn't very much go into the account here that's given by Eagleton, because I think he just replicates what we read in Bruns, more or less, and puts a little bit of a Marxist spin on it. That's all. And what he's going to end up doing, by the way, at the end of both of them, is to show that both sides, this view and that view, are invalid, which I agree. They are invalid. So I agree to some degree with his criticism, but where do you stand outside of that? Well, he's still in the communistic unity camp. Now, what's interesting is that after he writes this is written in the early 80s, he makes a shift back towards his earlier Catholicism, as in he was taught in high school, and is a little less Marxist in his expression of things. He becomes a little bit more, he's more interesting, actually. But I put this on the course to introduce you to, when I introduce you to literary theory, I am interested in the theories. I also need to introduce you to the historical discipline and what those who practice literary theorists think, to help you to engage with them. And in general, they accept Eagleton's view. And so let's look at how they present that. Yes?
I just wanted to add a comment. I believe in the Hegelian phenomenological method, where he talks about dialecticism, I think, the Hegelian dialectic, in which there's an analysis.
Thesis, an antithesis, and then a synthesis.
And a synthesis.
Right.
So it's the reconciliation of differences. And I believe, if I'm correct,
So it'll be a one and a nothing, and then it will be aufgehoben to some other thing.
Yeah. And it's a historicist because it's continually progressing. Everything's in a state of becoming, so there's no actual essences, so to speak. But
so his account of history is called the Phenomenology of Spirit.
Yeah.
Phenomenology des Geistes.
And it's all tending towards a final analysis in which all differences will be reconciled.
But how can you reconcile pure materialism from pure nothingness? There is no reconciliation between the two.
What's the spiritualization of it?
Right, well, it has to.
Yeah.
Like 1 times 0 is 0. 1 plus 0, you have 1. But there is going to be a resolution, but it's not going to be somewhere between 1 and nothing. It's going to be either or. It's going to be absolute, imminent, sort of Nazi Germany, or it's going to be annihilation. But there is no, Hegel doesn't lead anywhere. It just, here's the way we make progress. We do this, and there's a solution to the problem, but it's just provisional. Once we're on board with that, we'll recognize the limitations of that historical situated solution and then move to the next progressive one, because we'll always be caught up in the historical situatedness of being and with its concurrent and concomitant limitations, and we will then just move beyond that to the next stage, and it will be a little bit better than what came before. That's the rational process posited to it. Anyway. But yes, you're right. Yes?
This is kind of a bit, I just related this bit of different stream of thought. But,
Please.
Did you see the new Napoleon movie that came
Not
out?
yet.
Yeah. I mean, not so much related to that specifically, but when we were watching it, I was kind of thinking, like, I never really knew where to fit Napoleon into my understanding of that, because obviously France, you have the Enlightenment, right? We talked about Versailles, and then you also have the French Revolution falling on that, and then Napoleon comes along, right? So
Yep.
Does he more appeal to a romantic ideal?
Yes.
Or is it
he's clearing out Europe of medievalism, and he's going to topple the kings around Europe, and he's going to bring in the French Revolution. He's going to import it all around Europe. He's a bit of a distraction to some degree from the problems of the French Revolution in France, because the immediate response to the French Revolution is that the people that execute the king come into power, and then they have a power struggle, and it results in the reign of terror and chaos, and it just keeps on getting more chaotic, and a strong man has to come in to resolve the chaos. The strong man is Napoleon. Napoleon, rather than solving the problems in-house, although he does that to some degree, just takes the fight around the other countries, and everybody's saying, hooray, France, France, victorious, whatever, the tricolor everywhere, and we're going to bring all of Europe under the French Revolution by toppling the establishment, which ends in Waterloo, more or less, at least militarily. It doesn't intellectually. The French Revolution is more than a physical act. It's an idea, and the idea still exists. The revolutionary ideology. So I don't know what's presented in that Napoleon film. I saw the Oppenheimer movie instead. We chose, and I looked at it, and the Oppenheimer is pretty good.
Yeah.
Probably hands down. Yeah, that's what I thought.
Napoleon, that movie, they just get so distracted. I guess it's because it's what would appeal to the mass audiences today. But too much of the movie is dedicated to his whole relationship with his wife, which, obviously you want to put in the film is interesting, but they spend way too much
time on it. Yeah.
I feel like you didn't really get a.
You need a good director.
Yeah.
And the script. Yeah.
Yeah, you need a good understanding of who Napoleon was also on that philosophical level.
On that philosophical level, what he meant and so forth. Yes. Yeah. Napoleon represents an orderly way of imposing the French Revolution, in a sense, by the Louis XIV, by force.
Yeah.
We'll bring it in by force. And he has supporters, by the way, all around Europe. They're not just in the French army. There are people in the countries that want to bring about the French Revolution where they are, but they lack the means to do it. Well, we'll help you do that. We'll take them out, and then we'll bring in the Napoleonic Code as the legal code, which will replace your laws, the laws of your lands right now. And that includes in countries that had been based on common law, rooted in biblical law. Intensely problematic. But yeah, no, I haven't seen the film. I intended on seeing it, but I suspected if I had one choice, I'd be better with Oppenheimer. Mm-hmm. Although even that, it has sordid, it has these sexual scenes, and they contribute nothing to the plot at all. And I thought, and I love Christopher Nolan. I think he's a great director. I thought, you put those in to get Academy Awards, because it seems like the recipe for an Academy Award. You have to have gratuitous, sort of weird sex scenes in there. I think this just doesn't fit with the movie at all. I mean, you can suggest it, and you're losing nothing anyway. It's frustrating me because I would let my kids watch the movie had it not been for that. But anyway.